Introduction to the shocking scandal of 2016 in the United States. In the heart of 2016, the United States was rocked by an unprecedented scandal within its gymnastics community, a revelation so disturbing that it rippled far beyond the confines of the athletic world and ignited conversations about abuse, accountability, and institutional failure across every corner of American society. What started as a seemingly ordinary year, filled with Olympic anticipation and pride, swiftly transformed into one of reflection and outrage for millions across the nation. At the core of this seismic moment was an exposé that would tear back the curtain on decades of hidden suffering, a succession of sexual abuse perpetrated against some of the country's most promising young athletes by those entrusted with their care and development. The backdrop was nothing short of iconic. American women's gymnastics had, for decades, represented a bastion of national pride, a team hailed for their discipline, perseverance, and a seemingly endless parade of medals on the world's largest sporting stages. Olympic heroes became household names, poster children for hard work and impossible dreams. Parents watched them with admiration. Little girls everywhere wore their leotards and dreamed of following in those golden footsteps. But beneath the glitter and the spotlights, there existed a dark undercurrent, an insidious culture that allowed predators to flourish in silence. The initial spark for this scandal came not from institutional confession, but as a result of persistent, courageous investigative journalism. On August 4, 2016, the very day the Rio Olympics commenced, the Indianapolis Star published an article that would plunge America into a state of disbelief and horror. Quietly and relentlessly, the paper had spent months collecting allegations, tracing decades of complaints that had been minimized, buried, or outright ignored by the various governing bodies of gymnastics. The investigation illuminated a chilling pattern. Hundreds of female gymnasts, most of them minors at the time, had reported being subjected to sexual abuse by coaches, trainers, and, in particular, a certain revered team doctor. Many of their voices were stifled, their experiences dismissed as fabrications or unfortunate misunderstandings. Some women were shamed, others signed non-disclosure agreements, and many, fearing for their athletic futures, remained silent for years. The revelation was far more than a singular criminal case. It symbolized the failure of an entire system. Leading sports institutions had, whether by willful ignorance or self-serving complicity, prioritized trophies and profit over justice and the safety of their athletes. For years, these systemic lapses enabled one of America's most notorious predators to operate unchecked, the same man who had once treated Olympic champions and earned the adulation of peers, parents, and the public alike. As the details came to light, it became impossible for those in positions of authority to plead ignorance. The magnitude of the abuse exposed not only the horror of individual crimes but painted a sobering portrait of a culture more invested in preserving its reputation than protecting its own members. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. How could such widespread abuse continue for so long under the watchful eyes of celebrated coaches, administrators, and institutions? What safeguards had failed, and how many warning signs were ignored in pursuit of victory and public acclaim? The impact was immediate and profound. Survivors found courage and solidarity, giving voice to decades-long traumas, while the public and media rallied in outrage and support. For American sports, it was a moment of reckoning, a recognition that the mechanisms entrusted with nurturing and safeguarding talent could not and did not protect those most vulnerable. This scandal wasn't just a sports story, it was a national tragedy that challenged the collective conscience and forever altered the landscape of American athletics. U.S. women's gymnastics team, the pinnacle of glory and its dark side. The United States women's gymnastics team has long stood as a beacon of excellence on the international athletic stage, an embodiment of the American dream where grit, discipline, and immeasurable talent pave the road to glory. Over the decades, these gymnasts have transformed from promising youths into icons of sport, captivating audiences by delivering awe-inspiring routines and clutching gold medals at global competitions. From the thunderous applause of Olympic arenas to the dazzling lights of television commercials and front pages, U.S. gymnasts became household names. Their stories, marked by early mornings demanding trainings and personal sacrifice, resonated with families across America. For many, having a child on the national team wasn't just an aspiration, it was an entrance ticket to a world of fame, scholarship offers, endorsement deals, and opportunities otherwise out of reach. The image painted in the media was one of unity, joy, and unwavering pursuit of excellence, where coaches were mentors and teammates were lifelong friends. Yet behind all the sparkle and glory lay another reality, a complicated web concealed by the sheen of achievement. In a world where competitive gymnastics requires entry at a shockingly young age, girls sometimes as young as 5 or 6 were plucked from everyday life and thrust into a high-pressure environment. Their days were regimented, stretch, leap, tumble, repeat, under the unblinking eyes of coaches and officials seeking perfection. The drive for medals created an atmosphere where physical and emotional endurance was non-negotiable, and the performance always took priority. The standards were uncompromising. Bruises, pain, and exhaustion were part of the process. In this climate, speaking up about injury, discomfort, or anything less than absolute commitment was discouraged, even stigmatized. Gymnasts learned to suppress doubt and fear, relying on authority figures who wielded immense power over their progression and their dreams. Unbeknownst to the adoring public, this culture of idolization and strict hierarchy proved fertile ground for more sinister behavior to thrive. With young athletes taught deference to their coaches and medical staff, boundaries became ill-defined. The same adults celebrated for their mentoring and expertise also enjoyed unchecked access, often kept above scrutiny because of their professional reputations and the medals they delivered. This dichotomy, the glory visible on the podium and the shadows lurking in the training rooms, became especially deadly. Success became a shield. Medals protected reputations and masked abuses. Many athletes credited their coaches and doctors for their victories, feeling indebted and pressured to toe the line. As a result, questionable conduct often went unreported or dismissed, and concerns about athlete well-being were subordinated beneath the pursuit of hardware for the nation. In summary, while the U.S. women's gymnastics team was a source of national pride and hope for generations, its relentless pursuit of victory and perfection enabled a darker system to fester beneath the surface. The consequences of this divide would remain hidden for years, until the events that shocked and forever changed the American sporting landscape. The shocking opening event from the Rio Olympic Games Inauguration Day. The opening of the 2016 Rio Olympics was supposed to be a celebration, a dazzling stage where the world's greatest athletes would shine and the hopes of nations would be pinned on their every move. In the United States, all eyes were on the women's gymnastics team. Their past performances had made them national darlings, and the media buzzed with anticipation about how these remarkable young women would once again dazzle the world. Yet, on the very day when glitter and pageantry filled Rio's grand arenas, a storm was quietly brewing back home. The Indianapolis Star, a Midwestern newspaper not typically in the international spotlight, released a lengthy and meticulously researched exposé that would forever shift the narrative, not only for American gymnastics but for sport in general. In the midst of Olympic fever, their article landed like a precision-dropped bombshell, cutting through the noise with devastating clarity. This was no ordinary sports journalism. The Star's investigation went far beyond questions of training techniques or medal prospects. It brought to light decades of hidden abuse, painting a picture of systemic rot that had festered unnoticed while the world celebrated acrobatics and artistry. The timing could not have been more jarring. As the nation cheered for gold, it was being confronted with a legacy of pain and betrayal lurking beneath the surface of its proudest athletic institution. The article described a pattern, repetitive and chilling, of sexual abuse perpetrated by influential adults within the gymnastics world, mostly targeting minors entrusted to their care. It detailed how complaints were routinely dismissed, reports were downplayed or ignored, and entire institutions worked, wittingly or unwittingly, to keep such stories buried. Instead of making headlines for Olympic triumph or defeat, American gymnastics became a focal point for a national reckoning about safeguarding children, holding powerful organizations accountable, and challenging the culture that permitted predators to thrive. Within hours of its release, the news sent shockwaves through both sport and society at large. Survivors began to come forward, some privately, many eventually publicly, sharing stories that reflected the report's painful truths. For countless viewers, the celebration of the Games became unavoidably intertwined with this haunting new reality. The Star's timing gave a voice to victims at the climactic moment when the world was listening. It forced the country to turn its pride and its outrage toward self-examination, and demanded a new standard of vigilance and care moving forward. Hundreds of victims and the prolonged silence. For decades, the United States women's gymnastics program was lauded as a pinnacle of athletic achievement, its gymnasts celebrated as paragons of dedication and discipline. But beneath the shining surface of medals, televised competitions and childhood dreams, a darker truth simmered, one that involved not just a handful of victims, but a veritable wave of hidden suffering. As investigations would ultimately reveal, hundreds of young athletes, most of them minors when their ordeals began, were subjected to a pattern of sexual abuse by individuals who were supposed to protect and nurture their growth. It is staggering to reflect on the scope. At least 368 reported gymnasts, though experts and advocates suggest that the true number could be even higher, considering so many assaults go unreported due to shame, fear, or trauma. Like a silent epidemic, the abuse wound its way through clubs, training centers, and even the hallowed grounds of national team camps. Why did this happen, and why did it go unchecked for so long? Much of the answer lies in the toxic culture of silence that permeated the sport. Many victims felt overpowering pressure to stay quiet. Speaking up didn't just risk public disbelief or personal shame, it threatened dreams of competing at the highest level, college scholarships, or even just returning to the gym one more day. The culture of obedience to authority, the reverence for celebrated coaches and team doctors, made questioning or reporting abuse nearly unthinkable. Too often, when athletes or their families did come forward, their complaints were dismissed, minimized, or quietly swept under the rug by those in positions to protect, most disturbingly by institutional leaders whose primary concern seemed to be preserving reputation rather than safeguarding children. Particularly disturbing is how many victims revealed they were isolated by fear. The abuse was rarely an open secret. Instead, it was cloaked in a false sense of medical necessity, professionalism, or mentorship. Predators exploited routines, privacy, and the trusting relationships formed with young gymnasts, often manipulating not just the athletes but their families as well. Many survivors have since recounted the devastating moment they realized what they endured wasn't just an isolated accident or misunderstanding, it was part of a calculated system that benefited from their continued silence. The emotional and psychological impact was immense. Many athletes well into adulthood described years if not decades of anxiety, guilt, post-traumatic stress, and strained relationships with their bodies and others. The dominant narrative for too long was that these girls and young women were simply fortunate to have a shot at greatness. Their sacrifices, however harrowing, were a required toll on the road to the Olympic podium. The reality, now laid bare, shows that the silence came at an unbearable cost, not only to the individuals involved, but also to the moral fabric of American sport itself. The first ones who dared to speak out. The first cracks in the wall of silence surrounding the abuse scandal in American gymnastics came from an extraordinary act of bravery. In a system that for decades dissuaded, pressured, and outright silenced victims, for a survivor to speak out required an almost unimaginable level of courage. The narrative began to change in 2016 when, spurred by a groundbreaking investigative article, several women dared to step forward, putting not only their trauma, but also their reputations, careers, and even personal safety on the line. The most significant catalyst in breaking the silence was Rachel Denhollander, a former gymnast turned attorney. Upon reading the exposé in the Indianapolis Star, she recognized an opportunity to reveal her own experiences and potentially encourage others to do the same. Rachel's detailed email to the newspaper named Larry Nassar, the revered team doctor, as her abuser. This act of naming such a powerful and respected figure electrified both the media and the athletic community. Unlike previous accusations that had faded into obscurity, Rachel chose to identify herself publicly, allowing her story to become a focal point for a growing movement. Her courage proved contagious. In the weeks that followed, 2 more gymnasts stepped out of the shadows, including a former Olympic champion. These athletes were not anonymous. Their public personas came with the weight of expectation, scrutiny, and for some, substantial commercial interests. Yet, they risked it all to corroborate Rachel's account, detailing stories of abuse eerily similar to hers. Their testimonies revealed not just isolated incidents but a calculated, repeated pattern of exploitation. What made these early revelations so powerful was the specificity and candor with which they were delivered. Survivors did not simply recount vague memories, they described in painstaking detail how abuse was concealed under the guise of medical treatment or special mentorship and how naive trust in authority was manipulated. For many, this was the first time they had ever said these words aloud, let alone to a national audience. The risk of ridicule, disbelief, or professional consequence loomed large, but the unstoppable momentum had begun. Importantly, these testimonies kicked open a door that had long been kept shut by institutional complicity. The courage of the first survivors sparked a domino effect. Dozens, then hundreds more, felt empowered to add their voices. They were bolstered not only by the growing chorus echoing their pain but by the unprecedented public support and outcry. Grassroots advocacy groups and social media played a crucial role, amplifying survivor voices and making it impossible for the story to be swept aside as it had so many times before. The bravery of these first accusers fundamentally shifted the conversation from one of suspicion and blame towards empathy, justice, and institutional reformation. Their willingness to be seen and heard, to risk everything for the sake of truth, set in motion a reckoning the world of sports, and the nation itself, could no longer ignore. The Angel Doctor and the True Face. For years, Larry Nassar was celebrated as a trusted figure within the elite world of American gymnastics. A self-effacing, always smiling physician whom athletes, parents, and coaches saw as indispensable. He attended countless championships and Olympic Games, treating the nation's top gymnasts with what appeared to be genuine care and passion. Parents were reassured by his gentle demeanor and reputation. Coaches leaned on his expertise, and many young athletes confided in him as both a doctor and a role model. Nassar collected numerous accolades and rose to an almost mythic status within sporting circles, revered for his contributions to the success story of American women's gymnastics. However, beneath this carefully curated image lay a horrifying truth. Larry Nassar was systematically exploiting his position for decades, subjecting hundreds of girls and young women to sexual abuse under the guise of medical treatment. Many of his patients were teenagers, some as young as 12 or 13. He employed medical language to rationalize inappropriate behavior, convincing both athletes and their families that his actions were legitimate parts of care protocols. The boundaries between trust and violation blurred so thoroughly in his examination rooms that many victims did not even recognize the abuse until years later. Nassar's double life was chillingly calculated. While he was lauded in public, behind closed doors, he manipulated the faith placed in him, weaponizing his knowledge and institutional authority. He developed a reputation for being the go-to doctor for pain management and injury recovery. This afforded him private access to athletes in hotel rooms, training facilities, and even remote camps, often without supervision. His emotional manipulation was just as destructive as his physical abuse. He created feelings of dependency, gratitude, and even guilt in his victims. Some young women, doubting themselves and isolated by their own fear, questioned whether they had misunderstood his treatment. What is most staggering in hindsight is the sheer audacity with which Nassar committed his crimes. He groomed not only his patients but the entire network supposed to oversee and safeguard their welfare. He spoke at conferences, collaborated on research, and positioned himself as an expert in the well-being of athletes, building a wall of credibility around himself that was nearly impossible for outsiders to penetrate. Complaints, when they did arise, were routinely dismissed by those in authority who could not or would not believe such a revered figure was capable of extraordinary evil. The contrast between the angelic doctor image and the reality of his criminal predation is a painful indictment of how charisma, trust, and power can be warped in environments that idolize expertise above scrutiny. For years, Nassar evaded suspicion, aided by the silence of those who feared reprisal or embarrassment and by institutions unwilling to jeopardize their own reputations. Only when survivors found their collective voice was the true extent of the betrayal, and the suffering, finally exposed for all to see. The cover-up system and the power of evil. For years, the criminal acts hidden within the world of American women's gymnastics were not solely the responsibility of one individual. They were the product of a deeply flawed, interconnected system. The machinery of silence that allowed Larry Nassar and others to continue their abuse was forged by powerful institutions whose primary concern was far too often their own reputation, profit, and viability over the safety and dignity of young athletes. Institutional protectionism became the silent accomplice. Major organizations from Michigan State University to USA Gymnastics and even the United States Olympic Committee operated with layers of bureaucracy and self-interest designed to shield themselves from scandal rather than protect the vulnerable. Internal investigations were routinely cursory, focused on public relations rather than accountability. Complaints and reports of inappropriate conduct vanished into black holes of paperwork, committees, or internal reviews that yielded little action. Whistleblowers, whether they were athletes, parents, or concerned staff, found themselves up against a wall of secrecy and denial. One of the system's most insidious tools was its misuse of legal mechanisms. Non-disclosure agreements, confidential settlements, and even direct intimidation were all used to keep victims quiet and reputations polished. Families were sometimes pressured to avoid legal action or public complaints, with the promise of swift resolution or the threat of destroyed careers dangling over their heads. The mechanisms supposedly meant to resolve grievances were often little more than roadblocks, complicating rather than aiding transparency and justice. What made the cover-up system so durable was its ability to manipulate trust. Parents, desperate for their children's athletic futures, were reassured by the prestige and authority of these organizations and their staff. Coaches, doctors, and administrators were granted nearly unchecked power, often regarded as quasi-parental figures, beyond reproach. This culture of deference, combined with layered systems of power, allowed the pattern of abuse to continue even in the face of repeated red flags and whispered warnings. Perhaps most haunting was the collective refusal to listen. All too often, reports brought directly to school administrators or gymnastics leadership were minimized as misunderstandings or blamed on the growing pains of demanding sports environments. Instead of being protected, many survivors were isolated, their credibility attacked, or even persuaded to doubt their own experiences. The system safeguarded itself by casting victims as troublemakers or attention seekers, solidifying a climate of fear and resignation. Even when the walls began to crack, the institutions moved slowly, more concerned about legal liability and media coverage than immediate reform or support for survivors. There were carefully worded public statements promising to investigate or expressing sympathy, but behind closed doors, little changed. Internal leaders prioritized the continuity of championships, sponsorship deals, and national prestige, fearing that public scandal would cause irreparable harm to their brands. This bureaucratic inertia made it nearly impossible for victims to break through. When a case did make it to someone in authority, the first instinct was often to protect reputations, to handle things in-house, delay real action, or shuffle problematic staff around quietly, rather than confront the root problem. Layers of deniability, where nobody seemed ultimately responsible, became a fortress for those with power. Law enforcement was sometimes no better. In certain cases, reports brought to local police or campus departments were mishandled or even ignored. These failures were not always due to malice, but sometimes ignorance of how abuse in elite sports presents differently than in ordinary circumstances. Still, the result was the same. Abusers were rarely confronted, and victims were left carrying the weight alone. Only when the evidence became overwhelming, in effect impossible to suppress, did the system finally begin to unravel. It was not a single broken link, but a chain of complicity, formed by individuals, departments, schools, and national authorities that either looked away or actively silenced the cries for help. The scale of inaction, fueled by bureaucracy and a worship of success, demonstrates that the true power of this crime lay not only in the deeds of one man, but in the shield built brick by the very institutions meant to uphold trust, safety, and justice. The court session and the horrifying truth revealed. The events inside the courtroom marked a watershed moment, not just for American gymnastics, but for the country's entire awareness of institutional abuse. The proceedings against Larry Nassar quickly grew beyond a typical criminal trial. It became a public reckoning, broadcast live, dissected by the media, and watched by millions. At the heart of this spectacle was not just a single perpetrator, but an appalling legacy laid bare. Years of silence shattered by the courageous testimonies of survivors. In 2018, after Nassar's arrest and the avalanche of evidence uncovered by federal investigators, including tens of thousands of child pornography images discovered on his computer, the legal process began in earnest. The courtroom became a stage for truth, a space where the silenced finally took back their voices. Over the course of several harrowing weeks, more than 150 women and girls stepped forward to deliver victim impact statements. Each testimony was raw, emotional, and unique, yet together they painted a chillingly consistent narrative of betrayal, manipulation, and unspeakable pain. The survivors, many of them having spent years convincing themselves their pain was invisible, finally faced their abuser, surrounded by families, supporters, and a nation watching. The statements ranged from trembling voices to powerful, unwavering declarations of resilience. Some women had become Olympic champions, others were young athletes whose dreams had been extinguished by trauma. Each one detailed the calculated methods Nassar used to exploit trust and the lingering effects of that abuse: anxiety, depression, fear, shattered self-worth, and physical suffering that would never fully heal. What set these proceedings apart, and gave them an unprecedented gravity, was the judge's decision to provide survivors as much time as needed to share their stories, uninterrupted and unfiltered. Dozens of testimonies poured out over days. Family members wept in the gallery, reporters documented every word, and in homes across America, viewers sat stunned by the courage and candor on display. The magnitude of victim participation underscored the breadth of Nassar's crimes, but also spotlighted the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate with near impunity for decades. Many survivors used their time not only to confront Nassar but to indict the institutions that had looked the other way: USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the U.S. Olympic Committee. Some even called out coaches, administrators, and fellow medical professionals by name, demanding accountability for those who had ignored or minimized complaints. The proceedings exposed in excruciating detail how Nassar had manipulated the trust placed in him as a medical professional, often hiding his crimes under the guise of treatment. Survivors described the gaslighting and invalidation they faced whenever they tried to raise concerns, sometimes being told their experiences were just part of standard procedure, sometimes being encouraged to stay silent for the sake of the team, and always overshadowed by the aura of authority that insulated Nassar from scrutiny. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with emotion, and yet there was a palpable sense of solidarity and hope, forged from the unity of so many individual voices finally being heard. Judge Rosemarie Aquilina, who presided over the case, famously told each woman who spoke that she was believed and her voice mattered, words that resonated far beyond those four walls and offered some measure of healing. Nassar's own brief addresses to the court, attempts at apology, were met by outrage, as survivors and the public rejected any notion of remorse without true accountability. The gravity of his crimes and the sheer number of victims stripped away the mask of respectability he had worn for so long. The judge's scathing rebuke during sentencing reflected the mood of a nation. What had occurred was not merely the isolated crimes of a bad apple, but a catastrophic breach of trust that reverberated through every level of sport and society. By the end of the sentencing phase, Nassar received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never again be in a position to harm anyone. The courtroom legacy, though, was much larger. For the survivors, this was not the end of the pain, but it was a beginning, the first step toward justice, recognition, and the hope that change would follow. The world had heard them, and in voicing their truth, they made it impossible for future abuses to hide in the shadows. The collapse of the big shots and their massive compensation. In the scandal's devastating aftermath, the mighty institutions once seen as untouchable pillars of the athletic world found themselves collapsing under the weight of public outrage and legal scrutiny. No longer could the leaders and administrators hide behind gold medals, sponsorships, and carefully crafted images. The revelations triggered a seismic chain reaction that toppled some of the most influential figures and organizations in American sports. High-profile resignations happened in rapid succession. The president and board members of USA Gymnastics stepped down, accepting that their authority had been irreparably undermined. Michigan State University's president, along with the athletic director and other senior personnel, were forced to relinquish their posts as internal investigations exposed not only mishandled reports, but also a culture of neglect and willful ignorance. Entire coaching staffs faced public disgrace or dismissal, training facilities shuttered, and previously lauded camps now bore a permanent scar in their histories. But the consequences extended far beyond symbolic resignations. For the first time, there was serious reckoning with the financial and moral costs of the years-long cover-up. Multiple civil suits, class action complaints, and federal investigations converged, resulting in staggering settlements. USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and related parties agreed to pay a combined total approaching $880 million, one of the largest compensation packages in the history of American sport. The sheer scale of these settlements was a harsh acknowledgement of the irreparable harm inflicted on survivors, many of whom faced a lifetime of psychological and emotional trauma. These payouts, however, were not simply about monetary restitution. They symbolized a shift in the way institutions would be held to account from that point forward. Court-mandated changes, oversight reforms, and new protocols were required as part of the settlements. Independent monitoring was imposed to ensure that USA Gymnastics and other governing bodies actually followed through on commitments to athlete safety and mandatory reporting. Provisions were set in place to increase transparency, empower whistleblowers, and establish channels for athletes to speak directly to third-party advocates rather than just their federations. At a broader level, the legal and public reckoning fundamentally altered the sports landscape in America. Sponsors pulled out or renegotiated contracts with strict ethical clauses, several national and local training centers lost accreditation, and the U.S. Olympic Committee announced sweeping overhauls in its oversight of minor athletes. The message sent to sports organizations everywhere was unmistakable. Unchecked power and institutional silence were now liabilities that could, and would, result in catastrophic loss, both reputationally and financially. Despite their size and resources, these giants could not escape responsibility for their role in enabling or overlooking years of abuse. For some survivors, the slow but unmistakable implosion of entrenched leadership delivered a measure of validation, if not full closure. Watching those who had once dismissed or minimized their pain answer publicly for their failures was a critical step toward national healing. Yet, no sum of money or public apology could ever fully compensate for the suffering endured or reverse decades of lost innocence. The fallout sent ripples across other domains as well. Educational and sporting institutions nationwide began to reevaluate their safeguarding policies, whistleblower protections, and complaint procedures. Other organizations previously mired in unrelated scandals referenced the gymnastics case as a grim cautionary tale. Insurance markets for athletic governing bodies hardened, demanding stricter risk prevention. Losses of this magnitude were simply no longer tolerable from a business perspective. The dominoes that started with the big boys falling influenced a generational shift in how American institutions approach oversight, transparency, and the balance between glory and responsibility. Powerful awakenings from victims. The voices of the survivors, those who had long been denied a platform and dignity, became the moral epicenter of the entire reckoning. When Olympians like Simone Biles, Aly Raisman, and Michaela Maroney stood before Congress and media cameras, their testimonies carried a force no institution could deflect. It wasn't just about verbally recounting trauma, it was about exposing the poisonous effects of denial, dismissiveness, and a culture that once prioritized gold medals over the well-being of children. One by one, survivors painted a picture not only of personal violation, but of systemic betrayal. In impassioned speeches and open letters, they spoke of begging for help and being ignored, of reporting physical and emotional pain only to be gaslit or threatened with loss of opportunity. Through these accounts, the world learned that abuse seldom happens in a vacuum, and that the deepest wounds are often inflicted by indifference and inaction from those meant to protect. Their words often broke through the boundaries of sport, resonating across broader sectors, schools, youth camps, universities, and even corporate America. By openly sharing their darkest chapters, survivors challenged generations of hush-hush mentalities that allowed predators to act with impunity. The message was both simple and revolutionary. Silence is complicity, and collective recognition is the first step toward change. Powerful as their personal testimonies were, the survivors did not stop there. They channeled pain into activism, advocating for legislative reform, third-party oversight, and trauma-informed care. They attended community forums, met with lawmakers, and used social media to gather momentum, mobilizing not only fellow athletes but anyone impacted by institutional abuse. Their efforts contributed to new child safeguarding policies, mandatory reporting laws, erased non-disclosure clauses, and clear complaint pathways for future generations. Institutional reform and commitment. Following the monumental exposure of abuse and the relentless advocacy of survivors, American sports governing bodies were compelled to announce sweeping reforms and public commitments, measures aimed not just at repairing reputations but fundamentally transforming how athlete safety is prioritized and protected. The phrase institutional reform gained new urgency as Congress, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC, and USA Gymnastics each faced mounting pressure to address the root causes that enabled systemic abuse. At the outset, Leaders from both USA Gymnastics and the USOPC publicly acknowledged their failures for the first time. They issued nationwide apologies not only to the survivors, but to the broader public whose trust had been betrayed. These apologies were not just rhetorical flourishes, they served as the opening salvo for a series of organizational overhauls. Administrators pledged to overhaul reporting mechanisms, implement third-party oversight, and dismantle the insular chains of command that had historically allowed abusers to exploit gaps in the system. No longer would complaints be kept in-house. Instead, independent safe sport bodies and survivor advocates would be given a direct role in monitoring investigations. Central to these reforms was the introduction of stricter policies on mandatory reporting. Training sessions and certifications on abuse prevention became compulsory for coaches, staff, and even athletes. The system now mandated immediate action when allegations surfaced, eliminating gray areas, and criminal penalties loomed for those who might attempt to cover up or ignore abuse reports. Severing ties with individuals facing credible accusations became standard protocol, and vetting new hires took on unprecedented rigor. Financially, institutions faced intense external scrutiny. Multi-million-dollar settlements and the threat of legal action from both state and federal authorities forced governing bodies into a position of rare vulnerability. Much of this pressure was leveraged to ensure ongoing compliance, court-mandated audits, routine check-ins by independent watchdog agencies, and direct access to ombudsman services for athletes. These mechanisms were put in place not only for USA Gymnastics but extended broadly to all Olympic sports under American jurisdiction, ensuring the reforms could not be easily ignored in favor of expedient results or short-term profits. Even the structure of leadership underwent a tectonic shift. Boards were expanded to include survivor representatives, and direct lines of communication were established between current athletes and organizational decision-makers. Whistleblower protections were significantly strengthened. No longer could testimonials of abuse be buried or diluted by legal intimidation or confidentiality agreements. In tandem, the U.S. Congress introduced new child protection laws, most notably the Empowering Olympic, Paralympic, and Amateur Athletes Act, which set federal standards for accountability and established avenues for independent investigation. Transparency, long the bane of organizational gatekeepers, finally emerged as the linchpin of reform. Publicly accessible dashboards, annual reports, and real-time statistics on complaints and outcomes became standard practice. Media scrutiny was not only tolerated but encouraged, as survivor advocates demanded that meaningful change be tracked and verified by independent journalists and watchdog groups. Failure to comply meant not only legal exposure, but the risk of losing public and private funding, a step that helped to hold even the most resistant institutions to a new level of responsibility. Education also emerged as a core component of lasting reform. Revised curricula on consent, power dynamics, and bystander intervention were integrated into youth programs at every level. National governing bodies funded outreach initiatives in both rural and urban communities, partnering with local schools and parent groups to spread awareness. The message, once cloaked in secrecy and shame, was now one of openness. Speaking up was encouraged and celebrated, and resources for physical and psychological recovery were woven into the athlete support system. Perhaps most critically, survivor voices were no longer sidelined. Individuals who had spoken out became central figures in reform discussions, providing direct input on policy drafts, training materials, and cultural transformation campaigns. Their lived experiences offered invaluable perspectives that shaped not just reactionary fixes, but lasting structural shifts. The motto across the American athletic landscape became clear: never again would winning take precedence over well-being. Still, these reforms were not always met with immediate success or universal acceptance. Some insiders resisted changes, arguing that overcorrection risked undermining performance or complicating operations. Nonetheless, the sheer weight of public demand, litigation, and moral reckoning ensured that silence and denial could no longer act as shields. For the first time in decades, the balance of power tilted decisively towards the safety, dignity, and agency of athletes. Darkness still lingers and the costly lesson remains. Despite a tidal wave of reforms and unprecedented public reckoning, the battle against abuse and institutional complicity in American gymnastics, and by extension in youth athletics everywhere, is far from over. Like a stubborn shadow, the threat of power being misused, of vulnerability being exploited, still lurks in the corners that no amount of money or apology can fully illuminate. Many survivors speak openly about how their pain did not simply vanish in the wake of court victories or public apologies. Trauma is stubborn, an invisible companion that outlasts any news cycle or compensation check. Psychological wounds manifest in waves, anxiety, distrust, flashbacks, and haunt not only gymnasts but their families who grapple with guilt, anger, and helplessness. In this sense, the story is a warning. Wrongs of the past cannot be erased by public contrition alone. They demand sustained daily vigilance. What became glaringly obvious amid the fallout was how fragile the safeguards were in the first place. Even the best-laid policies written with noble intent mean little if they exist only on paper or become diluted over time by complacency, budget cuts, or shifting organizational priorities. The hard lesson is that transparency, oversight, and open communication are not one-time fixes. They are living commitments requiring care and renewal. The temptation to slip back into old patterns is always present. Cutting corners in pursuit of success, dismissing inconvenient complaints, or allowing charismatic leaders too much unchecked power. For many in the broader world, schools, sports leagues, youth camps, this case became a cautionary tale, invoked in meetings and training sessions as a reason to self-scrutinize. Yet the headlines fade, institutional memories are short, and the urgency to protect the vulnerable can wane without constant reinforcement. There remains a risk that hard-won lessons dissolve in the collective rush to move on, or restore luster to reputable names. Another lasting challenge is the complicated nature of prevention itself. While policies and education are crucial, mandatory background checks, anonymous tip lines, stronger whistleblower protections, the real difficulty is cultural. Silence can be insidious and persistent. Victims may continue to feel shame, fear, or uncertainty about coming forward, not just because of what might happen, but because of what already did. It requires more than just new rules. It takes building trust steadily, one experience at a time, so that asking for help is seen not as a risk, but as a courageous and commendable act. Just as striking, this hard-earned wisdom underscores that vigilance cannot rest solely with survivors or a select few advocates. It's a community mandate. Parents, coaches, doctors, officials, teammates, even fans all share the duty to champion safety and dignity above titles or record books. True change emerges when care for individuals outweighs the quest for glory, and when challenge to authority is normalized, not penalized. The darkness persists where communities allow it to, either by indifference or by rationalizing that it can't happen here. In reflecting on the scale of damage done, perhaps the hardest but most vital lesson is humility. The recognition that there is no absolute safeguard and that power, unchecked, always threatens to become perilous. This means a never-ending willingness to ask tough questions, even of institutions or people we cherish. Are complaints truly being heard? Are safeguards not just installed but actively enforced? Are we rewarding those who speak up or punishing them with silence and exclusion? Ultimately, the legacy of this tragedy and its messy aftermath is a challenge that goes far beyond gymnastics. It is a demand for empathy, patience, and relentless scrutiny of how we define success, protection, and responsibility in every corner of society. While the darkness may never vanish entirely, the courage to confront it again and again is the only way the hard lessons paid for in pain and loss do not become lessons forgotten.